They sailed into the open Pacific without maps, without compasses, without any of the instruments we assume are necessary to cross an ocean. They navigated by stars, by the feel of swells beneath their hulls, by the flight patterns of birds they had memorized across generations. They settled islands separated by thousands of miles of open water, Hawaii, Easter Island, New Zealand, in an expansion so vast and so precise that modern oceanographers still struggle to fully model how it was done. For decades, we called them the greatest navigators in human history and left it at that. The story seemed complete. Remarkable, yes, mysterious perhaps, but fundamentally settled. They came from Southeast Asia, spread across the Pacific, and arrived. End of story. The history books said so. The textbooks said so. And for a long time, nobody looked closely enough at the evidence to realize that the story we were telling was only half of one, because the DNA says something else entirely. The accepted model of Polynesian origins goes like this. Around 3,500 years ago, a seafaring people ancestrally connected to populations in Taiwan and the Philippines began moving eastward into the Pacific. They carried a distinctive archaeological signature, a style of pottery called lapida, characterized by intricate geometric designs, found across a trail of island sites stretching from Papua New Guinea into western Polynesia. Over centuries, their descendants island-hopped further and further east, eventually reaching the most remote corners of the Pacific Ocean. By approximately 1000 CE, they had settled Hawaii to the north and New Zealand to the southwest, completing what archaeologists called the greatest maritime expansion in human prehistory. It was a beautiful model. Clean, linear, supported by language data, by pottery sequences, by the geographic logic of prevailing winds and currents. The Austronesian language family traces back to Taiwan with unusual precision. The story had a clear beginning, a traceable middle, and an identifiable end, and then there was South America. Sitting 4,000 miles to the east of the nearest Polynesian island, behind a wall of open ocean that even modern sailors treat with respect. No lapida pottery, no Austronesian languages, no archaeological evidence of contact. The accepted model placed South America entirely outside the Polynesian story. Two worlds, separated by an impassable blue corridor, developing in complete isolation until 1492. That was the story. It was wrong. The cracks had been appearing for a long time, but nobody wanted to look at them directly. The first crack was a plant. The sweet potato, Ipomoea batatas, is native to South America. Its wild ancestors grow in the Andes. It requires human cultivation. It cannot drift across an ocean on its own, cannot be carried by birds, cannot arrive on a remote Pacific island by any mechanism other than deliberate human transport. And yet, sweet potatoes were growing across Polynesia, in Hawaii, in New Zealand, in the Cook Islands, in Easter Island. When Europeans first arrived, they were not a post-contact introduction. The varieties found in Polynesia were genetically distinct from those brought by later Spanish traders, diverged enough to indicate centuries of independent cultivation. Someone had crossed the Pacific before Columbus. The botanical evidence was sitting there in plain sight for over a century, and the academic world managed to mostly look away from it, attributing it to chance dispersal mechanisms or leaving it as an awkward footnote. The second crack was in the bones. On the island of Mocha, off the coast of Chile, archaeologists recovered skeletal remains from pre-Columbian layers of sediment with features inconsistent with purely indigenous South American populations. It was filed away. The third crack was in oral traditions. Polynesian societies preserved stories of voyages to a distant eastern land called Haiva, from which certain plants and knowledge had been brought. Oral traditions are not archaeology, but they are data. For decades, each crack was treated in isolation. The sweet potato was a botanical anomaly. The bones were ambiguous. The oral traditions were mythology. And the model held because the model was comfortable, and because nobody had the tools to truly test it. Then the tools arrived. In 2020, a team of geneticists from the Natural History Museum of Denmark, collaborating with researchers across Europe and the Pacific, published a study in the journal Nature that changed the conversation permanently. They analyzed the genomes of 807 individuals, ancient DNA from skeletal remains and modern DNA from living populations across Polynesia, coastal South America, and the broader Pacific. What they found was not a whisper. It was a signal. Clear, statistically robust and impossible to explain away. Indigenous populations from several Polynesian island groups carried a measurable genetic component of South American origin. Not European, not post-contact contamination, South American. The signal appeared in populations from the Marquesas, from the Tuamotus, from Easter Island, from Hawaii. And when the researchers modeled the timing of this admixture event, they arrived at a date somewhere between 150 and 230 CE. More than 200 years before Columbus. More than 200 years before any European set foot in the Americas, some population of Polynesians had made contact with the indigenous peoples of South America, intermingled with them, and carried the genetic record of that contact back across the ocean. The DNA was not ambiguous. It appeared in multiple island groups, in a consistent pattern, pointing to a single contact event, or a small number of closely spaced events, that left a biological trace across the entire Eastern Pacific. The greatest navigators in human history had done something we hadn't given them credit for. They had found an entire continent and come home. But the DNA study raised as many questions as it answered. Because crossing the Pacific is not something you do by accident. The distance from the eastern Polynesian islands to the coast of South America is approximately 4,000 miles. The Pacific's prevailing winds in the eastern section blow predominantly from east to west, meaning a voyage from Polynesia to South America required sailing largely against the wind. This is not a drift. This is not an accident. This is an intentional, directed, planned ocean voyage. The answer, it turns out, is that the premise itself was wrong. Modern studies of Pacific weather patterns have identified periodic reversals of the trade winds, episodes where the winds shift direction for weeks or months at a time. These reversals, associated with El Niño events, opened navigational windows in which an eastward voyage became not just possible but, for a skilled navigator who understood the ocean's rhythms, foreseeable. The ancient Polynesian navigators who read currents and stars and bird migrations with an accuracy we barely understand would have known about these windows. They waited for them, recognized them when they came and sailed. They crossed. They arrived on the coast of what is today Colombia or Ecuador. They met the people there. They traded, mingled, lived alongside them long enough for genetic exchange to occur. And then, and this is the detail that still produces something close to vertigo, they turned around and sailed 4,000 miles back home. The indigenous peoples of the South American coast were not passive recipients in this exchange. The DNA signal runs in both directions. Chicken bones recovered from archaeological sites in Chile, dated to before European contact, carry a genetic signature consistent with Pacific chickens, not European ones. The chickens, domesticated in Southeast Asia and carried across the Pacific by Polynesian voyagers, arrived in South America before Columbus arrived in the Caribbean. The sweet potato traveled west. The chickens traveled east. Genetic material moved in both directions. This was contact, extended enough, intimate enough, to leave biological evidence that survived 800 years, and was finally readable only when the tools of modern genomics caught up with the scale of what had actually happened. There is a man alive today in the Marquesas Islands whose ancestry carries, somewhere in the deep architecture of his genome, a sequence of nucleotides that originated in a population living on the coast of South America 800 years ago. He may not know this. The history taught to him in school did not include it, and yet it is there, embedded in his cells, as real and as permanent as any document. The Polynesians were always described as extraordinary. But there was something subtly diminishing in the way that compliment was framed, because the story stopped at the edge of the Pacific. They were extraordinary navigators who settled islands. Full stop. The DNA rewrites that sentence. They were extraordinary navigators who found an entire continent, made contact with its peoples, exchanged plants and genes and knowledge across one of the most formidable oceanic barriers on the planet, and then carried that exchange home across 4,000 miles of open water. That is not the same story. It is a fundamentally larger one. Every answer the genetics provides opens a corridor of new questions. If the contact happened between 150 and 230 CE, and the evidence suggests it did, then what happened in that contact? What was traded beyond sweet potatoes and chickens? What knowledge crossed in both directions? What did the coastal peoples of South America teach the voyagers who arrived on their shores? What did those voyagers carry back in their minds, not just in their hulls? The genetic data can tell us that contact happened. It can tell us approximately when. It cannot tell us what was said or what was learned. It cannot reconstruct the moment when a Polynesian navigator first saw the mountains of South America rising from the eastern horizon and understood, with whatever emotional and cognitive framework they had available to them, that they had found something no one in their world had found before. That moment of recognition, the vertigo of a horizon that should have been empty but wasn't, is lost to time. Those moments live in the spaces between the data, in the oral traditions that were partially recorded and partially lost, in the DNA of living people who carry the evidence of an encounter their ancestors never wrote down. In the structures of language, where researchers are now looking for loanwords and grammatical traces that might mark the edges of that ancient contact, the story is not finished, it is barely begun. We needed simple stories because the evidence was incomplete, and because human beings require narrative to make sense of time. The Polynesians went east. The Americas were isolated. The Pacific was a barrier. These were not lies. They were the best available approximations of a truth that was more complex than the available data could reveal. The Polynesian story is not an isolated case. It is an example of something happening across every field that touches human origins: genetics, archaeology, linguistics, physical anthropology. The clean narratives that once organized our understanding of the past are dissolving, not because the past was more chaotic than we thought, but because it was more connected, more entangled, more fully human than the simplified versions allowed for. Now the data is more complete. The ancient Polynesian navigators did not just settle the Pacific. They found the western edge of an entire hemisphere, met its people, and carried the evidence of that meeting in their bodies and their crops back across an ocean. History is not written in books. It is written in genomes. And the Polynesians, who were already extraordinary, turn out to have been extraordinary in ways that history never gave them credit for. The bones were silent. The sweet potato was ignored. The oral traditions were called mythology. And then the DNA spoke, and it said they went further than you thought. They always did.